I'm Isabelle Arlene, 38, and I've built a life that proves strength isn't measured by what your body can do. But I'll never forget being 9 years old at my cousin's wedding, watching my mother's face crumple with shame as she whispered, "I'm embarrassed by your wheelchair, Isabelle." Everyone's staring at us. That moment didn't just break my heart, it forged something unbreakable inside me. The daughter she was ashamed of became the woman who controlled everything she would ever need. And 30 years later, when she reached out with trembling hands, asking for help, I had a choice to make. If you've ever been made to feel like a burden by the people who should love you most, subscribe, because this is about the quiet power of deciding your own worth and who gets to benefit from the life you've built. The story really begins on a Tuesday evening in March when I was 4 years old. My father was driving us home from my grandmother's house, the windshield wipers fighting against a relentless spring rain. I remember the sound they made, rhythmic. Squeak that should have been soothing but somehow felt urgent that night. Dad had been quieter than usual during dinner, his mind somewhere else entirely. Mom kept shooting him concerned glances across Grandma's dining table, the kind of wordless communication that married couples develop over years together. I was oblivious to the adult tensions, focused entirely on the new coloring book Grandma had given me, my small fingers tracing the outline of a butterfly, planned to make purple and gold dot. The drunk driver ran the red light at Morrison and Fifth. I don't remember the impact itself. The human mind has merciful ways of protecting us from our worst moments. What I do remember is waking up in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and fear, surrounded by machines that beeped with mechanical precision. My legs felt strange. Actually, they felt like nothing at all. The doctors explained it too. My parents, in hushed tones, they thought I couldn't hear. Spinal cord injury, complete, permanent. Words that would reshape every assumption my family had ever made about our future. I watched my mother's face crumble as she processed what this meant not just for me, but for all of us. Those first weeks in the hospital were a blur of tests, procedures, and visitors who didn't know what to say. My father barely left my bedside, his eyes rimmed with red from sleepless nights and guilt that would follow him for years. He blamed himself completely, though the accident report would later show that nothing he could have done would have prevented it. The other driver had been traveling nearly 60 miles per hour through that intersection. My mother's response was more complicated. She grieved, of course, but beneath the sorrow I could sense something else taking root, a kind of overwhelming panic about what our lives would look like now. The family she had imagined raising, the daughter she had dreamed of watching grow up, the simple activities she had taken for granted, all of it had changed in an instant. The extended family rallied around us initially. Aunts and uncles brought casseroles and offers to help. Cousins sent get-well cards with crayon drawings of flowers and sunshine. But I noticed how conversations quieted when I entered a room, how people's eyes would dart to my legs and then quickly away, as if looking directly at my condition might make it contagious. My first wheelchair was a temporary hospital model clunky, institutional, designed for function rather than the life of a 4-year-old. But I adapted with the remarkable resilience that children possess. Within days, I was racing other kids in the pediatric ward, laughing as I navigated corners and learned to pop wheelies that made the nurses nervous. The real challenge came when it was time to go home. By the time I turned 5, the pattern had already begun to establish itself, though I was too young to recognize it for what it was. My mother had developed an intricate system of avoidance that she disguised as practicality and protection. "Isabelle, can't go to Emma's pool party," she would tell my father when invitations arrived. "You know how difficult it would be with all those stairs to the backyard?" When I protested that I could manage stairs just fine with help, she would stroke my hair and say, "I just don't want you to feel left out, sweetheart." But I was feeling left out increasingly so with each declined invitation, each missed opportunity. To be a normal kid doing normal things, the birthday parties I didn't attend, the playground dates that somehow never materialized, the family gatherings where we always seemed to have other plans. At 5, 6, 7 years old, I began to internalize the message that my presence was somehow problematic. The worst part was how reasonable, my mother made it all sound. She never said I couldn't do something because of my wheelchair directly. Instead, she painted detailed pictures of potential embarrassment and difficulty. What if the other children ask questions you're not ready to answer? She would wonder. Aloud, what if there's nowhere accessible for you to go to the bathroom? These concerns seemed loving on the surface, but underneath them was a deeper truth I was beginning to sense. My mother was the one who wasn't ready for questions, who couldn't handle the attention my wheelchair might draw. I remember one particular incident when I was 6. My classmate Jennifer had invited me to her birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese. I was so excited. I could barely contain myself. Arcade games, pizza, and a chance to show my friends how fast I could maneuver between the tables. When the invitation came home in my backpack, I thrust it toward my mother with the breathless enthusiasm that only children possess. Her face fell almost imperceptibly. To anyone else, it might have looked like simple concern, but I was becoming an expert at reading the micro-expressions that crossed her features whenever my disability entered the conversation. "Oh, honey," she said, taking the invitation and studying it with exaggerated thoughtfulness. "Chuck E. Cheese is so crowded and loud. And you know how those arcade games are designed? They're really not made for someone in a wheelchair." I suggested we call Jennifer's mom to ask about accessibility. My mother said that would be making a fuss. I offered to bring my own cushion to sit more comfortably in the booth. She worried about drawing attention to our situation. For every solution I proposed, she had a concern that sounded reasonable but felt like rejection. The invitation ended up crumpled in our kitchen trash. I found it there the next morning while my mother was getting dressed, smoothed it out with small hands, and hid it in my room like evidence of a crime I didn't understand. I was supposed to have committed DOT at school. When Jennifer asked why I couldn't come to her party, I repeated my mother's explanations about the crowd and the noise. Jennifer suggested her mom could call my mom to work something out. I told her it was okay, that I didn't really like pizza anyway, a lie that tasted bitter in my mouth because pizza was actually my favorite food. This pattern repeated with devastating regularity. Class field trips became too complicated to navigate. Movie dates were too difficult because of theater accessibility. Even simple play dates at friends' houses were scrutinized for potential obstacles until the easier choice was always to decline. My father noticed. Of course, I would catch him watching my mother's face during these conversations, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Sometimes he would try to advocate for my inclusion, suggesting modifications or offering to come along to help. But my mother had developed a talent for making him feel unreasonable for pushing, for not understanding the real challenges we faced as a family. "You don't see what I see," she would tell him when she thought I wasn't listening. "You don't? Notice how people stare, how they whisper." I'm trying to protect her from that, but I was already noticing how people stared. I was already hearing whispers. The difference was that I was learning to navigate those reactions while my mother was learning to avoid them entirely. And in avoiding them, she was teaching me that I was something to be hidden, something that required protection, not because I was precious, but because I was problematic. The other children at school didn't seem to care about my wheelchair after the initial curiosity wore off. They helped me reach things on high shelves, included me in games with simple modifications, and treated me like any other kid. It was only at home that my disability felt like a burden, like something that cast a shadow over every family decision. By the time I turned 7, I had learned to preemptively reject invitations before my mother could. Was easier to tell? My friends, I was busy then to watch her face struggle with the logistics of my inclusion. I was becoming complicit in my own exclusion, and I didn't even understand why. The morning of Cousin Sarah's wedding, I woke up with a kind of excitement that made my stomach flutter. At 9 years old, I understood that weddings were important, magical events where everyone dressed up and celebrated love. More importantly, this was a family event we couldn't avoid. My mother's sister would never forgive an absence from her daughter's wedding. I had been looking forward to this day for months. My dress was beautiful, a soft blue that my mother had chosen specifically because it complemented my eyes. It had taken 3 trips to find the right one, and I remember feeling so grown up as we searched through racks of formal wear. My mother actually consulting me about which style I preferred. For those brief shopping trips, It felt like any other mother and daughter preparing for a preparing for a special occasion. The morning preparations began with careful attention to every detail. My mother styled my hair in an elegant updo that made me feel sophisticated beyond my years. She applied a touch of clear lip gloss and even a hint of blush, treating me like a young lady rather than a child. I sat still as a statue in my wheelchair, afraid to move and disturb the perfection she was creating. "You look absolutely beautiful, Isabelle," my father said when he saw me, and the pride in his voice made me sit up even straighter. My mother smiled, but I caught her glancing at the wheelchair, already calculating the logistics of the day ahead. The church was everything I had imagined. White roses and baby's breath adorning every pew, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, in jeweled patterns across the floor. As we arrived, I marveled at how elegant everyone looked, how happy and festive the atmosphere felt. This was exactly the kind of event I had been missing, and I was determined to prove that my presence enhanced rather than complicated the celebration. Other family members greeted us warmly, though I noticed the familiar pattern of eyes dropping to my wheelchair before returning to my face with slightly forced smiles. Aunt Margaret made a point of telling me how lovely I looked, while Uncle Robert awkwardly patted my shoulder and said I was such a brave girl. These interactions had become routine, and I had learned to respond with gracious thank yous that seemed to put everyone at ease. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Cousin Sarah looked radiant in her flowing white gown, and her groom couldn't stop smiling as they exchanged vows. I found myself genuinely moved by the love they shared, imagining my own future wedding day and wondering if someone would ever look at me the way Sarah's husband looked at her. During the reception, however, the careful choreography of inclusion began to break down. The photographer was arranging family groups for formal portraits, and I watched as relatives clustered together in various combinations. When it came time for the extended family photos, I positioned myself confidently in the front row, my beautiful dress arranged perfectly around my chair. But something was wrong. I could feel it in the photographer's hesitation, in the way family members kept glancing at each other uncertainly. Someone suggested that the wheelchair might be hard to work around in the formal shots. Another relative wondered aloud if it might be better to take some photos with me and some without, for variety. My mother's face had gone pale, and I watched her struggle with a decision I didn't understand. She was looking at me, then at the photographer, then at the other family members with an expression I had never seen before: shame, pure and simple. "Maybe Isabelle could sit in a regular chair for the pictures," someone suggested helpfully. "She can't transfer easily," my father said quietly, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. That's when it happened. As the photographer continued to organize the group and family members shuffled around trying to solve the problem of my inclusion, my mother leaned down close to my ear. Her voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for me, but the words hit like a physical blow. "I'm embarrassed by your wheelchair, Isabelle. Everyone's staring at us." The words hung in the air between us for what felt like an eternity. I stared up at her face, searching for some sign that she hadn't meant it, that I had misheard, that this was some terrible mistake. But her expression confirmed what my heart already knew. She was ashamed of me. Not protective, not concerned about my comfort or happiness, but genuinely embarrassed by my presence in her family's special moment. The rest of the reception passed in a blur. I smiled when spoken to, participated in conversations when included, and tried to act like everything was normal. But something fundamental had shifted. The beautiful dress no longer felt special. It felt like a costume designed to disguise something shameful. The careful hairstyle felt like an attempt to distract from the wheelchair that made my mother cringe. On the ride home, we sat in silence. My father glanced at us in the rearview mirror several times, sensing the tension, but not understanding its source. My mother stared out the passenger window, perhaps replaying the day's events, perhaps already forgetting the words that had changed everything for me. I carefully preserved that piece of blue fabric when I outgrew the dress, a small reminder of the day I learned that love, even from family, could come with conditions I could never meet. It was the day I began to understand that my mother's vision of our family didn't include space for a daughter in a wheelchair, no matter how beautiful the dress or how perfectly arranged the hair. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I made a promise to myself that I was too young to fully understand, but old enough to feel with absolute certainty. Someday, I would be successful enough, valuable enough, powerful enough that no one would ever dare to be embarrassed by me again. The weeks following the wedding marked the beginning of what I now recognize as the complete unraveling of any pretense that my mother and I had a normal relationship, where once she had disguised her discomfort with my disability as protective concern, now there was simply distant scold unmistakable, and growing wider each day. I threw myself into schoolwork with an intensity that surprised even my teachers. If my mother was embarrassed by my wheelchair, then I would give her something else to focus on achievements so remarkable that they would overshadow any perceived shortcomings of my physical condition. I stayed up late completing extra credit assignments, volunteered to help with classroom projects, and raised my hand to answer every question, as if academic excellence could somehow earn back the unconditional love I had lost on my report cards. Became flawless documents, straight A's, accompanied by glowing comments from teachers about my dedication, intelligence, and leadership potential. I would present these achievements to my mother with barely contained hope, waiting for the pride and celebration that never came. She would glance at the grades, nod approvingly, and file the reports away without ceremony. "That's nice, dear," became her standard response to accomplishments that other parents would have framed and displayed. Meanwhile, the pattern of exclusion that had begun subtly in my early years became more pronounced and less apologetic. School events that required parental involvements, science fairs, talent shows, parent-teacher conferences suddenly became scheduling conflicts for my mother. She had joined a book club that seemed to meet exclusively during my important events. She developed mysterious headaches that prevented her from attending school plays where I had earned speaking roles. My father began to fill these gaps, showing up alone to cheer me on with an enthusiasm that felt both genuine and compensatory. I could see the questions in other parents' eyes when he arrived solo, could sense his discomfort as he made excuses for my mother's absence. "She's not feeling well," became his go-to explanation, delivered with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The dynamic at home shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Family dinners became quieter affairs, with my mother participating in conversations about my father's work or household logistics, but falling silent when the topic turned to my activities or achievements. She stopped asking about my day, stopped helping with homework, stopped engaging in the small daily interactions that bind mothers and daughters together. I found myself gravitating toward Mrs. Patterson, my fourth-grade teacher, who seemed to genuinely enjoy my company and celebrate my potential. Mrs. Patterson was everything my mother wasn't. Enthusiastic about my ideas, proud of my accomplishments, and completely unbothered by the logistics of my wheelchair. During lunch periods, I would stay in her classroom to help organize supplies or simply talk about books we were reading. She became the adult who asked meaningful questions about my thoughts and dreams, who noticed when I was struggling, who made me feel valued for who I was rather than despite what I couldn't do. "You have a remarkable mind, Isabelle," Mrs. Patterson told me one afternoon as I helped her arrange bulletin board displays. "I hope you never let anyone convince you otherwise." I didn't tell her that someone already had. The extended family's behavior began to mirror my mother's emotional withdrawal. Invitations to birthday parties and holiday gatherings started arriving, addressed only to my parents, with vague suggestions that they check their schedules before committing to attendance. When we did attend family events, I noticed how photographs were composed to minimize the visibility of my wheelchair, how conversations shifted when I joined groups of relatives, how my cousins were encouraged to play gently with me, as if I were fragile rather than simply different. My father's growing awareness of these dynamics created tension in my parents' marriage that even I could sense. I would hear them talking in low, urgent voices behind their bedroom door, conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached. He began taking me on solo outing trips to the library, visits to museums, afternoons at the park, activities that felt both wonderful and sad because they highlighted my mother's absence. "Your mom loves you very much," he would say during these outings. The words carrying the weight of someone trying to convince himself as much as me. She just doesn't always know how to show it. Right. But I was old enough to understand the difference between love that was conditional and love that was unconditional, between support that came with reservations and support that came without question. My father's love felt solid and dependable, even when tinged with guilt and sadness. My mother's love had become something I had to earn daily, something that could be withdrawn if I became too much trouble or drew too much attention. The most painful part wasn't the big moments of rejection, it was the accumulation of small absences. That created a constant ache in my chest. The bedtime stories that stopped being offered. The help with getting dressed that became perfunctory rather than nurturing. The casual physical affection that gradually disappeared until we existed in the same house like polite strangers. I began to understand that I was living with two different families, the one that existed when my father was present, where I felt valued and included, and the one that existed when it was just my mother and me, where I felt like an unwelcome guest in my own home. This dual reality forced me to become emotionally self-sufficient in ways that no 9-year-old should have to manage. Mrs. Patterson must have sensed the isolation I was experiencing, because she began creating opportunities for me to shine in ways that went beyond traditional academics. She recommended me for the school's peer tutoring program, where I helped younger students with reading. She suggested I join the debate team, where my quick thinking and articulate communication could be showcased. These activities became my refuge, places where my contributions were valued and my presence was genuinely wanted at home. I learned to celebrate my own achievements quietly, to find satisfaction in personal growth rather than external validation. When I received recognition for academic excellence or leadership, I would savor the moment privately before mentioning it casually to my parents. Prepared for my mother's lukewarm response and grateful for my father's overcompensating enthusiasm. The report card that should have been a triumph, perfect grades across every subject, accompanied by a note from the principal, recognizing my exceptional dedication and positive influence on school culture, sat on our kitchen counter for 3 days. Before my mother even acknowledged it, when she finally picked it up, she glanced at it briefly and said, "I hope you're not pushing yourself too hard, Isabelle." Even my successes had become something she wished I would minimize. Mrs. Patterson changed the trajectory of my life with a single suggestion made on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was helping her grade spelling test, a task I had volunteered for because it meant staying after school and delaying my return. To the increasingly tense atmosphere at home when she looked up from her desk with the kind of expression that meant she had been thinking about something important. "Isabelle, have you ever considered entering a writing contest?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular tone teachers use when they're about to open a door you didn't know existed. "There's a statewide competition for 5th graders, and I think you have something important to say." The contest theme was overcoming challenges, and while I initially resisted what felt like an invitation to turn my disability into a sob story, Mrs. Patterson helped me understand that my perspective was valuable precisely because it was authentic. She didn't want me to write about being inspirational or brave. She wanted me to write about being real. I spent weeks crafting that essay, pouring onto paper all the complicated emotions I had been carrying since the wedding day. I wrote about the difference between being different and being less than. I wrote about the assumptions people made and the assumptions I was learning to challenge. Most importantly, I wrote about the realization that my worth wasn't determined by other people's comfort with my existence. The essay wasn't about triumph over adversity in the traditional sense. Instead, it was about the quiet strength required to remain confident in your own value when the world, and sometimes your own family, suggests you should apologize for taking up space. I wrote about learning to navigate not just physical barriers, but the emotional barriers that other people's discomfort could create. When Mrs. Patterson read my final draft, I watched tears gather in her eyes, not pity tears, but tears of recognition and pride. "This is powerful, Isabelle," she said quietly. "You found your voice." The day of the award ceremony arrived with typical autumn crispness. It's a kind of clear October day that makes everything feel possible. Schools from across the state had submitted entries, and the winners would be announced at a formal ceremony in the state capitol. Mrs. Patterson had arranged to drive me herself, understanding without being told that this was too important to risk my mother's potential absence. My father took the day off work to attend, his excitement palpable as he helped me choose an outfit that would photograph well. My mother said she would try to make it, but had a few things to take care of first. I had learned not to count on her presence at events that celebrated my achievements, so I focused on my gratitude for Mrs. Patterson and my father rather than dwelling on another likely disappointment. The ceremony was held in an elegant hotel ballroom, with round tables draped in white linens and a stage decorated with flowers and banners celebrating student achievement. I felt sophisticated and important as we found our seats, surrounded by other families who had traveled from across the state to support their young writers. When they announced the winners in my category, I held my breath without realizing it. Third place went to a boy from the northern part of the state who had written about moving to America from Somalia. Second place was awarded to a girl who had written about her parents' divorce. And then first place in the 5th grade division goes to Isabelle Arlene Mitchell from Roosevelt Elementary. For her essay, The Space I Take Up. The applause seemed to echo from every corner of the room as I made my way to the stage, my heart pounding with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Mrs. Patterson was beaming from our table, and my father was standing to clap with an enthusiasm that made other attendees turn to look at him with amused smiles. Standing at that podium, holding my certificate and looking out at a room full of people who were celebrating my words and ideas, I felt something I had never experienced before: the absolute certainty that I had value that existed independently of other people's approval. This wasn't about overcoming my disability or being inspirational despite my circumstances. This was about the power of authentic expression and the validation that comes from being truly heard. The prize included a $500 savings bond and the opportunity to read my essay aloud. As I spoke my own words into the microphone, watching the audience lean forward to listen, I understood that I had discovered something more valuable than academic achievement. I had found my voice, and people wanted to hear what I had to say. My father's pride was overwhelming and beautiful. He took dozens of photos, introduced me to everyone we met as my daughter, the award-winning writer, and treated me to an elaborate celebration dinner, where he asked me to read passages from my essay aloud because he wanted to hear them again. My mother did eventually arrive at the ceremony, slipping in during the reception portion of the evening with apologies about traffic and prior commitments. She congratulated me politely and posed for a few family photos. But I could see her scanning the room, perhaps wondering what other parents thought about our family, about me, about the attention my wheelchair inevitably drew. But for the first time, her discomfort didn't diminish my joy. I had learned something crucial that day: that my perspective had value, that my voice mattered, that I could create space for myself in the world rather than waiting for others to make room for me. The certificate became more than an award. It became proof that I had something important to contribute, something that existed entirely apart from my family's complicated dynamics. Mrs. Patterson had been right. Had found my voice. And once found, I was determined never to let anyone convince me to silence it again. The quiet, accommodating child who had learned to minimize herself to ease her mother's embarrassment was beginning to transform into someone who understood that taking up space wasn't something to apologize for, it was something to claim with confidence. That night, I placed the certificate on my desk where I could see it every morning when I woke up. A daily reminder that my words had power and my perspective had worth. It was the beginning of understanding that I could write my own story rather than accepting the role others had assigned to me. High school arrived like a fresh start I hadn't known I needed. Roosevelt High was larger and more diverse than my elementary and middle schools, filled with students from different backgrounds who hadn't grown up with assumptions about what I could or couldn't do. For the first time since early childhood, I had the opportunity to define myself on my own terms, rather than living within the limitations others had placed on me. The summer before freshman year, I made a decision that would prove transformative. Instead of waiting to see what opportunities might be offered to me, I decided to actively seek out leadership roles that would showcase my capabilities. When student council nominations opened in September, I didn't hesitate to put my name forward for freshman class representative. The decision horrified my mother in ways I had learned to anticipate but no longer allowed to influence my choices. "Are you sure that's wise, Isabelle?" she asked when I mentioned my intention to run. "Student government requires so much visibility. And what if you don't win? Wouldn't that be disappointing?" But I had moved beyond seeking her approval or avoiding her discomfort. The writing contest had shown me that I had something valuable to offer, and I was determined to find platforms where my voice could be heard and my ideas could make a difference. My campaign strategy was straightforward: focus on concrete improvements I could bring to the freshman experience rather than asking for votes based on popularity or sympathy. I proposed extended library hours during exam periods, better communication between faculty and students about assignment expectations, and the creation of peer tutoring programs that would help struggling students while providing leadership opportunities for those who excelled academically. The speeches were held in the main auditorium during an assembly that the entire freshman class was required to attend. As I positioned myself at the podium, looking out at nearly 300 of my peers, I felt the familiar flutter of nerves that accompanied any moment when I made myself vulnerable to judgment. But stronger than the nervousness was the confidence I had been building since that first writing contest, the knowledge that I had valuable ideas and the communication skills to present them effectively. My speech lasted exactly 3 minutes and focused entirely on practical improvements rather than personal narratives. I didn't mention my wheelchair, didn't ask for votes based on overcoming adversity, and didn't position myself as an inspirational figure. Instead, I presented myself as a capable leader with specific plans for making our shared experience better. The applause that followed was enthusiastic and sustained, and I could see in my classmates' faces that they were responding to my ideas rather than my circumstances. Several students approached me afterward to ask follow-up questions about my proposals, treating me as a serious candidate rather than a feel-good story. When the votes were counted 2 days later, I had won by a significant margin. The victory felt different from the writing contest. This wasn't about individual achievement, but about my peers choosing to trust me with representation and leadership. They had looked at all the candidates and decided that I was the one they wanted speaking for their interests and concerns. My father's reaction was everything I could have hoped for. He took me out for a celebratory dinner and spent the entire evening asking thoughtful questions about my plans for the position and my long-term goals for student government. His pride was uncomplicated and genuine, unmarred by the concerns about visibility and attention that colored my mother's responses to my achievements. My mother's reaction was more complex. She congratulated me, of course, but I could see her calculating the implications of my new role, the meetings I would attend, the events I would help organize, the increased presence I would have in school activities. "I hope this doesn't interfere with your studies," she said, as if academic excellence and leadership were mutually exclusive rather than complementary. The responsibilities of student council proved to be exactly what I had hoped. I worked with administrators to implement the extended library hours, collaborated with teachers to create clearer communication channels, and helped establish the peer tutoring program that became one of my proudest accomplishments. Each successful initiative reinforced my growing confidence that I could identify problems and develop effective solutions. More importantly, the role connected me with other student leaders who shared my interest in making positive changes, rather than simply adding impressive titles to college applications. I formed genuine friendships with classmates who valued my contributions and treated me as an equal partner in our shared projects. By junior year, I had been elected student council president in a campaign that focused on expanding mental health resources and creating more inclusive programming for students with diverse needs. The platform wasn't specifically about disability advocacy, but rather about ensuring that all students felt valued and supported in their educational experience. The college preparation process that began during my junior year opened up possibilities I had barely dared to imagine. My combination of academic excellence, leadership experience, and community involvement made me a competitive candidate at selective universities. More importantly, the essay portions of applications allowed me to showcase the perspective and communication skills that had become my greatest strengths. I wrote application essays that were honest about my experiences without being defined by them, that demonstrated resilience without relying on inspiration narratives, and that showcased my potential for future leadership rather than dwelling on past challenges. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, not because admissions committees felt sorry for me, but because they recognized the value I would bring to their campus communities. When the acceptance letters began arriving, accompanied by scholarship, offers that would make college financially feasible, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that these opportunities had been earned through my own efforts and capabilities. Harvard, Stanford, Columbia universities that represented the highest levels of academic achievement were inviting me to join their communities based on merit rather than charity. My father's excitement about these acceptances was infectious and uncomplicated. He researched each university thoroughly, helped me weigh the advantages of different programs, and supported whatever decision would best serve my long-term goals. These were the conversations I had always wished I could have with my mother, discussions about potential and possibility rather than limitations and concerns. My mother's response to my college acceptances was characteristically complicated. She was proud, certainly, but I could sense her anxiety about what my departure would mean for our family dynamic. Part of me wondered if she had grown comfortable with our distant relationship and wasn't sure how to process having a daughter whose achievements were becoming impossible to minimize or ignore. The scholarship ceremony at the end of senior year felt like a culmination of everything I had been working towards since that first writing contest. Standing on stage as the recipient of multiple awards for academic achievement, leadership, and community service, I looked out at an audience that included teachers who had supported my growth, classmates who had trusted me with leadership, and my father whose pride was written clearly across his face. My mother was there too, sitting in the front row with an expression I couldn't quite read. As I accepted each award and listened to the descriptions of my accomplishments being read aloud, I wondered if she was finally beginning to understand that the daughter she had been embarrassed by had become someone worthy of celebration. The student council president badge I wore that day represented more than a title. It was proof that leadership wasn't about inspiring others through personal struggle, but about identifying shared goals and working collaboratively to achieve them. I had learned to command respect through competence rather than seeking sympathy through circumstance. High school had transformed me from a girl who minimized herself to avoid her mother's discomfort into a young woman who claimed space confidently and used that space to benefit others. The foundation was laid for everything that would follow, the understanding that I could create my own opportunities rather than waiting for others to include me, and that my value was determined by my contributions rather than other people's comfort with my presence. Choosing Stanford over Harvard was the first major decision I made without considering how it might affect my family's comfort level. The California campus offered exactly what I needed: distance from the complicated dynamics at home, a progressive environment that celebrated diversity and innovation, and academic programs that would prepare me for the kind of impact I wanted to make in the world. The 3,000-mile separation from my parents served as more than geographical distance. It created space for me to discover who I was when I wasn't constantly navigating my mother's discomfort or compensating for her emotional withdrawal. For the first time since childhood, I could simply exist without wondering whether my presence was creating problems for the people around me. My dormitory was fully accessible, and my roommate, a pre-med student from Oregon named Kelly, treated my wheelchair as just another piece of furniture that needed to be accommodated in our shared space. She never asked probing questions about my disability, never offered unwanted assistance, and never treated me like a source of inspiration or pity. Instead, she complained about my habit of staying up late studying, borrowed my notes when she overslept for lectures, and expected me to take my turn cleaning our shared bathroom just like any other roommate would. This normalcy was revolutionary. After years of being treated as either fragile or inspiring, being seen as simply another college student with strengths, weaknesses, and responsibilities felt like a gift I hadn't known I was missing. Academically, I thrived in ways that surprised even me. The double major in business and communications that I had chosen proved to be the perfect combination for someone interested in creating systemic change rather than simply achieving personal success. My coursework in organizational behavior, strategic communication, and ethical leadership provided frameworks for understanding how institutions could be transformed to work better for everyone. The professors at Stanford were unlike any teachers I had encountered before. They expected rigorous analysis, challenged conventional thinking, and valued perspectives that brought fresh insights to established problems. In seminars on corporate responsibility and inclusive design, my experiences as someone who had navigated exclusion and accommodation gave me unique insights that my classmates and professors found valuable. Dr. Margaret Rodriguez, my business ethics professor, became a mentor who helped me understand that my perspective on accessibility and inclusion could be a professional asset rather than a personal limitation. You see barriers that others don't notice, she told me during office hours one afternoon. That's not a burden, it's a competitive advantage in a world that's finally beginning to understand the value of universal design. My involvement in campus organizations followed the same pattern. I had established in high school seeking leadership opportunities that allowed me to create positive change rather than simply building my resume. I joined the student government, served on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and helped establish a mentorship program that connected students with disabilities to successful alumni in their fields of interest. But it was my work with the Campus Accessibility Advocacy Group that truly ignited my passion for systemic change. We didn't just complain about barriers, we proposed solutions, conducted research on best practices, and worked collaboratively with administration to implement improvements that benefited everyone. The curb cuts we advocated for helped students with mobility devices, but they also helped people with rolling suitcases, delivery workers with carts, and parents with strollers. These projects taught me that good accessibility design wasn't about special accommodations for a small population. It was about creating environments that worked better for everyone. This insight would later become the foundation of my business philosophy, but during college, simply represented the excitement of discovering that my perspective had genuine value in solving complex problems. The summer internships I pursued were strategic choices designed to build the skills and network I would need to create meaningful change in the business world. I worked for a consulting firm that specialized in organizational development, learning how companies could restructure their practices to be more inclusive and effective. I spent another summer with a technology company that was pioneering adaptive interface design, understanding how innovation could remove barriers rather than simply accommodate them. These experiences introduced me to professionals who became long-term mentors and collaborators. They saw potential in my combination of analytical skills, communication abilities, and unique perspective on accessibility challenges. More importantly, they treated me as a future colleague rather than a charity case, offering opportunities based on merit and expecting excellence in return. The phone calls home during college became shorter and less frequent, not out of anger or resentment, but simply because I was building a life that felt complete and fulfilling. My father remained enthusiastic about my achievements, asking detailed questions about my courses and celebrating each academic and leadership milestone. My mother's responses had become predictably lukewarm, proud, but somehow distant, supportive, but never quite celebratory. When I mentioned my internships and the career opportunities they were creating, I could hear the mixture of pride and concern in her voice. Part of her was impressed by my success, but another part seemed uncomfortable with how far I was traveling from the diminished expectations she had held for my life. Graduation day arrived with the crisp optimism of a California spring morning. I had earned summa cum laude honors, been inducted into 3 honor societies, and received departmental recognition for both academic achievement and campus leadership. The diploma I received represented more than the completion of my education. Symbolized the transformation from a girl who had learned to minimize herself into a woman who confidently claimed space and used that space to benefit others. My father made the trip to California for the ceremony. pride evident in every photograph and his enthusiastic participation in every celebration. He had become my most reliable supporter, someone who never questioned my capabilities or suggested that I should lower my expectations to avoid disappointment. My mother's absence from the graduation ceremony was explained as a scheduling conflict. But I had stopped being surprised or deeply hurt by her pattern of missing my important moments. Instead, I focused on the mentors, friends, and chosen family who had shown up to celebrate this milestone with genuine enthusiasm. Dr. Rodriguez's words during the reception stayed with me. "You're going to change how businesses think about inclusion, Isabelle. Not because of your personal story, but because of your professional capabilities and your insights into creating systems that work for everyone." Standing on that campus, where I had discovered my own potential, surrounded by people who valued my contributions and excited about the opportunities that lay ahead, I realized that I had successfully created a life where my worth was never questioned. The girl who had learned to anticipate rejection and minimize her presence had become a woman who confidently pursued ambitious goals and expected to achieve them. The job offers that were already arriving from companies that had recruited me during campus interviews represented more than career opportunities. They were invitations to join organizations that recognized my value and wanted to benefit from my perspective. I was no longer asking for inclusion. I was being sought out for what I could contribute. College had given me something more valuable than a degree or professional credentials. It had given me the complete confidence that I belonged wherever I chose to go, and that my presence would make those places better for everyone. The business world welcomed me with the kind of opportunities I had dreamed about but hadn't dared to expect. 3 major consulting firms had made compelling offers during my senior year, each recognizing the unique value I could bring to their diversity and inclusion practices. But after months of consideration and conversations with mentors, I realized that working within existing structures would limit my ability to create the kind of systemic change I envisioned. 6 months after graduation, I made the decision that would define the next decade of my life. I would start my own consulting firm focused on accessibility solutions for major corporations. The idea wasn't born from personal grievance or the desire to be inspirationally emerged from a clear-eyed assessment of a massive market opportunity that other consultants were overlooking. Arlene Accessibility Solutions was intentionally named after my middle name rather than my first. I wanted the company to succeed based on the quality of our work and the value we delivered. Not because clients felt good about hiring a business owner with a disability. The distinction mattered to me was building a company that would compete on merit, kick, and win contracts because we solved problems better than anyone else. The early months were challenging in ways I had anticipated and others that caught me completely off guard. Securing startup funding meant pitching to investors who sometimes struggled to see past my wheelchair to evaluate my business plan. I learned to open presentations by immediately establishing my credentials and expertise, making it clear that this was a conversation between professionals rather than a charity request. The breakthrough came when I landed a consultation contract with a major technology company that was facing potential litigation over their inaccessible office design. Rather than simply recommending costly retrofits, I conducted a comprehensive analysis that identified how universal design principles could improve functionality for all employees while addressing accessibility concerns. The solutions I proposed actually reduced their overall costs while creating a more efficient and pleasant work environment for everyone. The success of that project led to referrals, and referrals led to a growing reputation for delivering innovative solutions that served business objectives rather than simply checking compliance boxes. I wasn't selling accommodation, I was selling optimization. The distinction transformed how clients viewed accessibility from a burden to be managed into an opportunity for a competitive advantage. Within 2 years, Arlene Accessibility Solutions had grown from a 1-person operation to a team of 12. Specialists in architecture, technology, human resources, and legal compliance. Each team member was chosen for their expertise and professional excellence, creating a company culture where high standards and collaborative skill problem-solving were the norm. The awards and recognition began flowing in by year 3. Business magazines featured our innovative approaches to workplace inclusion. Industry conferences invited me to deliver keynote addresses about the ROI of universal design. Professional organizations recognized our work with awards for innovation and social impact, but the real validation came from our clients' results. Companies that implemented our recommendations saw measurable improvements in employee satisfaction, productivity, and retention. They also discovered that the accessibility features we designed attracted top talent from diverse backgrounds and demonstrated their commitment to innovation and inclusion to customers and stakeholders. My father followed every milestone with the enthusiasm of someone who had always believed this level of success was possible, but was thrilled to see it realized. Our phone conversations became strategic consultations, where he offered insights from his own business experience and celebrated each contract, win, and team expansion with genuine excitement. My mother's reactions remained complicated. She expressed pride in my achievements, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice when she tried to process how far I had traveled from the limited expectations she had held for my life. The daughter she had been embarrassed by was now featured on magazine covers and invited to speak at national conferences. The wheelchair she had found shameful was now positioned next to podiums where I addressed audiences of hundreds of business leaders. The luxury apartment I purchased in downtown San Francisco was a statement of independence that went beyond financial success. Every element was designed to be both beautiful and functional, demonstrating that accessibility could enhance rather than compromise aesthetic appeal. The space became a showcase for potential clients, proving that universal design principles could create environments that were elegant, efficient, and welcoming to everyone. My adapted vehicle was similarly strategic, a high-end car with seamless modifications that attracted admiration rather than pity. I had learned that perception mattered in business, and projecting success and competence was essential for being taken seriously in competitive markets. The Forbes 30 Under 30 recognition came during year 4, accompanied by a cover story that focused on business innovation rather than personal inspiration. The article analyzed our company's growth strategy, highlighted our unique approach to accessibility consulting, and positioned me as a thought leader in an emerging field. The recognition opened doors to even larger contracts and speaking opportunities at international conferences. More importantly, the magazine feature demonstrated that my success was being evaluated on the same criteria used for any other business leader: revenue growth, market innovation, and strategic vision. I wasn't being celebrated for overcoming adversity. I was being recognized for building a successful company that delivered value to clients and created positive change in the business world. The foundation I established during year 5 represented the evolution of my understanding about sustainable impact. Rather than simply building a successful business, I wanted to create pathways for other young people with disabilities to pursue their own entrepreneurial dreams. The foundation provided scholarships, mentorship, and startup funding for emerging leaders who shared my commitment to creating systemic change. By year 6, Arlene Accessibility Solutions had become a multi-million-dollar enterprise with offices in 3 cities and contracts with Fortune 500 companies across multiple industries. We had pioneered consulting methodologies that were being adopted by competitors and had trained a new generation of accessibility professionals who carried our standards of excellence to other organizations. The book deal that came during year 7 represented an opportunity to share insights about entrepreneurship, innovation, and creating inclusive businesses with a broader audience. Universal Advantage: Building Success Through Inclusive Design became a bestseller that further established my reputation as a thought leader and opened new revenue streams through speaking engagements and corporate training programs. Standing in my corner office, looking out at the San Francisco skyline and reflecting on the journey from that 9-year-old girl at a wedding to the CEO of a thriving enterprise, I understood that I had achieved something more valuable than financial success. I had built a life where my value was never questioned, where my contributions were actively sought, and where my presence made every space I entered more innovative and effective. The success felt complete not because I had proven my worth to family members who had doubted me, but because I had created a professional identity that existed entirely independently of their approval or disapproval. I was no longer the daughter who had been embarrassed by her wheelchair, was Isabelle Arlene, CEO and founder of a company that was transforming how businesses thought about accessibility and inclusion. The phone calls from extended family, members who had excluded me from events and photographs, began arriving around this time. Awkward attempts to reconnect, now that my success was impossible to ignore. Cousin Sarah reached out with apologies about the wedding day and invitations to family gatherings. I no longer needed to attend to feel valued and included. But the most significant call came from my mother, tentative and uncertain, asking if we could meet for lunch to catch up after years of distant conversations. I could hear in her voice that she was struggling to reconcile the daughter she had tried to hide with the woman whose achievements were being celebrated in national media. I had reached the point where I held all the power in our relationship, where I could choose the terms of any interaction or the level of involvement my family would have in my life. The girl who had learned to minimize herself to accommodate her mother's discomfort had become a woman who controlled her own narrative and decided who deserved access to her success and friendship. The realization was both empowering and sobering. I finally had everything I had worked for, but the relationships that should have celebrated this journey with me had been damaged beyond easy repair. David Harrison entered my life during a networking event hosted by the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, where I was delivering a presentation on how inclusive business practices drive innovation and profitability. He approached me afterward with thoughtful questions about implementation strategies and seemed genuinely interested in applying these concepts within his own law firm. He was everything I had imagined in a potential partner: intelligent, successful, articulate, and apparently comfortable with both my professional achievements and my disability. David was a partner at a prestigious corporate law firm specializing in intellectual property and technology law. Our initial conversations revealed shared interests in business strategy, social justice, and the potential for private sector solutions to address systemic inequalities. The courtship that followed felt like something from a romantic movie. David took me to elegant restaurants where he had clearly called ahead to ensure accessibility, planned weekend trips to locations he had researched for their inclusive amenities, and integrated me seamlessly into his social and professional circles. For the first time since high school, I was in a relationship with someone who seemed to see my wheelchair as simply one characteristic among many, rather than a defining limitation or inspirational symbol. Our professional collaboration added another dimension to the relationship. David's firm began contracting with Arlene Accessibility Solutions for consultation on workplace inclusion, and I found genuine intellectual compatibility in our discussions about law, business, ethics, and strategic planning. He understood my work not as charity or advocacy, but as sophisticated business consultation that delivered measurable value to clients. The proposal came during a weekend trip to Napa Valley, at a restaurant overlooking vineyards that stretched to the horizon. In every direction, David had arranged for a private table on the terrace, and his speech about wanting to build a life together was heartfelt and specific about the future he envisioned for us. The ring was beautiful, elegant, and understated, chosen to reflect my personal style rather than making a dramatic statement. I said yes with a kind of joy I hadn't experienced since my early professional successes. Here was someone who loved me completely, who celebrated my achievements without reservation, and who seemed to understand that my disability was just one aspect of a complex and successful woman. The engagement felt like the final piece of evidence that I had built a life where I was valued and cherished rather than merely tolerated. The engagement party David organized was held at his firm's elegant downtown offices, transformed for the evening into a celebration space that showcased both our professional success and personal happiness. Colleagues from both our companies attended, along with friends from various social and professional circles. It was exactly the kind of event I had dreamed of: sophisticated, inclusive, and focused on celebrating our relationship rather than managing anyone's discomfort. My parents flew in for the party, And I watched my father's genuine happiness as he met David and saw how respectfully and lovingly I was being treated. My mother's reaction was more complex as always, but she seemed to be making an effort to engage positively with the celebration and the man I had chosen to marry. But during the party, began to notice subtle signs that I initially dismissed as pre-wedding jitters or the normal stress of planning a major life event. David seemed slightly tense when we posed for photos, positioning himself in ways that minimized the visibility of my wheelchair. When colleagues and friends offered congratulations and asked about wedding plans, his responses were enthusiastic but somehow generic, lacking the specific excitement I would have expected from someone planning the happiest day of his life. The conversations about wedding venues revealed the first concrete evidence that something was wrong. David's suggestions consistently favored locations that were elegant but isolated, beautiful settings where photography could be carefully controlled, and guest lists could be limited to people who already knew us well. When I suggested venues that would allow for larger celebrations or more prominent locations that would photograph well for announcements, he raised concerns about logistics and expense that seemed disproportionate to his financial resources. The breaking point came during a discussion about our engagement announcement in the local business journal, a standard practice for successful professionals in our social circle. David suggested we skip the formal announcement, citing privacy concerns and professional discretion that felt hollow given his usual comfort with publicity for his legal victories and business achievements. When I pressed him about his reluctance, the conversation that followed revealed truths that shattered everything I had believed about our relationship. David admitted with obvious discomfort that he was concerned about how a high-profile marriage to someone in a wheelchair might affect his career prospects and social standing. He used careful language, speaking about optics and professional positioning, but the meaning was unmistakable. "I love you, Isabelle," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who believed his words could soften the impact of what he was revealing. "But I've worked very hard to build my reputation and client base. Some of our clients are from more traditional backgrounds, and I worry about how they might react to seeing us together in public settings." The words hit me like a physical blow, carrying the same devastating power as my mother's whispered shame at that wedding 25 years earlier. Here was a man who claimed to love me, who had proposed marriage and planned a future together, but who was fundamentally embarrassed by the visual reality of being associated with my disability in public settings. The engagement ring felt suddenly heavy on my finger as I realized that David's love came with conditions. It was fine in private, acceptable in controlled environments, but something to be minimized or hidden when it might affect his professional image or social status. He wasn't proposing a marriage. He was proposing a relationship where I would once again learn to make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's discomfort. The conversation that followed was brief and final. I returned the ring that same evening, along with a clear explanation that I would never again accept love that came with requirements to minimize my presence or hide aspects of my identity. David's shocked protests that he didn't mean it that way, and that we could work something out, only confirmed that he had fundamentally misunderstood both my character and my non-negotiable standards for how I expected to be treated. The end of the engagement was painful in ways that went beyond simple heartbreak. It forced me to confront the reality that even sophisticated, successful people who claimed to value inclusion could harbor deep discomfort with disability that revealed itself only when the stakes became personal. David's rejection wasn't based on incompatibility or changing feelings. It was based on shame about being publicly associated with my wheelchair. But the experience also reinforced lessons I had been learning since childhood about the importance of surrounding myself with people who celebrated rather than merely tolerated my presence. David's discomfort was his limitation, not mine, and his inability to imagine a successful marriage with someone who used a wheelchair revealed more about his character than about my worthiness as a partner. The empty ring box I kept served as a reminder that authentic love doesn't require you to minimize yourself, hide your reality, or accommodate someone else's shame about your existence. It also reminded me that I had built a life successful and fulfilling enough that I could afford to maintain high standards for who deserved access to my time, energy, and affection. My mother's response to news of the broken engagement was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire experience. Instead of offering comfort or expressing anger on my behalf, she suggested that maybe it was for the best, and that relationships can be complicated when there are additional challenges to navigate. Her words echoed David's concerns in ways that made clear she still viewed my disability as a burden that any partner would have to overcome rather than simply one characteristic of a complex and valuable person. That conversation marked the final deterioration of any hope I had maintained for a genuinely supportive relationship with my mother. If she couldn't recognize that David's behavior was unacceptable rather than understandable, then she was still fundamentally aligned with the perspective that had led her to whisper her embarrassment at that long-ago wedding. The broken engagement became a turning point that clarified my understanding of what I would and wouldn't accept in relationships. I would never again settle for love that came with conditions, never again accommodate someone's discomfort with my reality, and never again allow someone else's limitations to diminish my sense of my own worth. I was better off alone than with someone who was embarrassed by me, just as I was better off with chosen family than with relatives who viewed my success as something to be managed rather than celebrated. The year following my broken engagement became a period of unprecedented professional growth and personal clarity. Instead of retreating from public visibility as David had hoped I would do, I embraced opportunities that showcased both my expertise and my presence with renewed determination. If some people were uncomfortable with my success while using a wheelchair, that discomfort belonged to them. I would not diminish my achievements to ease anyone's prejudices. The Forbes 30 Under 30 recognition arrived like validation from the universe that I was exactly where I belonged. The magazine cover featured me in my executive office, positioned confidently behind my desk with San Francisco's skyline visible through floor 2 ceiling windows behind me. The wheelchair was visible in the photo, but it was simply part of the composition rather than the focus, exactly the kind of representation I had always hoped to see. The accompanying article analyzed Arlene, accessibility solutions, innovative business model, and rapid growth trajectory. The journalist interviewed clients who spoke about measurable improvements in productivity and employee satisfaction following our consultations. She quoted industry experts who described our approach as transforming accessibility from compliance burden to competitive advantage. Most importantly, the piece positioned me as a thought leader whose insights were valuable to any organization seeking to optimize their human capital and workplace efficiency. The magazine feature opened doors I hadn't even known existed. Speaking invitations arrived from major business conferences, university symposiums, and international forums on innovation and inclusion. Television producers reached out about interviews focused on entrepreneurship and business strategy. Book publishers expressed interest in my insights about building successful companies that prioritize inclusive design principles. Each opportunity reinforced the same message. My perspective was valuable not because it was inspirational, but because it was professionally insightful. Audiences wanted to learn from my business acumen, not my personal journey. The distinction mattered enormously to me. Was being sought out for what I knew, not what I had overcome. The speaking engagements themselves became opportunities to demonstrate the principles I advocated. I worked only with event organizers who ensured full accessibility not just for me, but for all attendees. I insisted on hotels and venues that met universal design standards. I required that my presentations be captioned and that materials be available in multiple formats. These weren't special accommodations. They were professional standards that benefited everyone. The audiences at these events ranged from Fortune 500 executives to university students, from government policymakers to nonprofit leaders. In every setting, I found people hungry for practical strategies to create more inclusive and effective organizations. My presentations focused on ROI data, implementation timelines, and measurable outcomes rather than personal narratives or emotional appeals. The book deal that emerged from these speaking Engagements represented the culmination of years of developing and refining ideas about business innovation and inclusive design. Universal Advantage, Building Success Through Inclusive Design, became a comprehensive guide for leaders who wanted to create organizations that worked better for everyone while achieving superior business results. Writing the book required me to articulate principles I've been developing intuitively throughout my career. The research phase involved interviewing successful companies that had implemented inclusive practices, analyzing performance data from organizations that prioritized accessibility, and documenting the competitive advantages that emerged from universal design approaches. The book launch tour took me to major cities across the country, where I spoke to packed auditoriums of business leaders eager to understand how inclusion could drive innovation and profitability. The questions from audiences revealed a growing recognition that accessibility wasn't just about compliance or charity, was about tapping into overlooked markets, attracting top talent, and creating products and services that appealed to broader customer bases. Media coverage of the book focused on business insights rather than personal inspiration, exactly as I had hoped. Major newspapers interviewed me about trends in workplace design and corporate culture. Business magazines quoted my research on the correlation between inclusive practices and employee retention. Television programs invited me to discuss the economic benefits of universal design principles. The foundation I established during this period represented the natural evolution of my understanding about sustainable impact. The Isabelle Arlene Foundation provided scholarships, mentorship, and startup funding for young entrepreneurs with disabilities who were developing innovative solutions to accessibility challenges. But the Foundation's mission extended beyond disability advocacy to support any young leader working to create more inclusive, effective organizations. The Foundation's first cohort of scholarship recipients included a brilliant young woman developing adaptive technology for workplace communication, a veteran creating accessible outdoor recreation equipment, and a recent graduate launching a consulting firm focused on inclusive marketing strategies. Their diverse projects demonstrated that accessibility innovation could emerge from any industry and benefit virtually any customer base. My luxury home in Pacific Heights became both a personal sanctuary and a professional showcase for the principles I advocated. Every element of the design demonstrated that accessibility could enhance rather than compromise aesthetic appeal and functional efficiency. The space regularly hosted Foundation events, client meetings, and social gatherings that allowed visitors to experience firsthand how universal design created environments that worked beautifully for everyone. The car I drove, sleek, high-performance vehicle with seamless adaptive modifications, made similar statements about the compatibility of accessibility and excellence. I had learned that in business settings, projecting success and competence was essential for being taken seriously, and every aspect of my professional presentation reinforced the message that accommodation and achievement were perfectly compatible. The recognition that meant the most came from my professional peers, other entrepreneurs and business leaders who evaluated my contributions based purely on merit and results. When industry associations honored me with awards for innovation and leadership, when competitors sought my insights about market trends, when potential clients chose our firm based on our reputation for excellence, I knew that I had achieved the goal I had set for myself since childhood, being valued for my capabilities rather than pitied for my circumstances. My father's pride in these achievements was uncomplicated and boundless. Our phone conversations became strategic consultations, where he offered insights from his own business experience while marveling at how far I had traveled beyond anything he had imagined possible. He kept scrapbooks of media coverage and spoke about my accomplishments to anyone who would listen with the enthusiasm of someone who had always believed this success was inevitable. My mother's reaction to my growing prominence was more complex. She expressed pride, certainly, but I could sense her struggle to reconcile the daughter she had tried to hide with the woman whose achievements were being celebrated in national media. The wheelchair she had found embarrassing was now positioned next to podiums where I addressed audiences of influential business leaders. The attention she had wanted to avoid was now focused on me as someone whose insights were actively sought by organizations around the world when extended family members began reaching out after years of distance. Their awkward attempts to reconnect revealed how dramatically the power dynamics had shifted. Cousins who had excluded me from events now sent invitations to gatherings I no longer needed to attend to feel valued. Relatives who had minimized my presence in family photos now wanted to be associated with my success. But the most significant change was internal, the complete confidence that I belonged wherever I chose to go, and that my presence would make those spaces more innovative and effective. I was no longer asking for inclusion. I was being recruited for what I could contribute. The girl who had learned to minimize herself to accommodate others' discomfort had become a woman who expected to be celebrated rather than merely tolerated. Standing in my office, looking out at the city where I had built a thriving enterprise and established myself as a thought leader, I understood that I had achieved something more valuable than financial success or professional recognition. I had created a life where my worth was never questioned, where my contributions were actively valued, and where I controlled the terms of every relationship and opportunity. The success felt complete not because I had proven anything to family members who had doubted me, but because I no longer needed their validation to know my own value. I had built a world where I was celebrated, sought after, and respected, a world where the only opinions that mattered were those of people who understood and appreciated what I brought to every situation. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office, the San Francisco fog just beginning to lift from the bay outside my windows. My father's voice carried a heaviness I had never heard before, and his first words, "Isabelle, we need to talk," immediately commanded my full attention. "Your mother has been diagnosed with breast cancer," he said, the words emerging slowly as if speaking them carefully might somehow lessen their impact. "Stage 3. The doctors say it's aggressive, but they caught it before it spread to her lymph nodes. It's going to need surgery, chemotherapy, and probably radiation." The silence that followed stretched between us across 3,000 miles and 30 years of complicated family history. I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I couldn't immediately untangle: shock, concern, old anger, and something that might have been the beginning of sympathy. This was the woman who had been embarrassed by my wheelchair, who had missed my major achievements, who had suggested that my broken engagement was for the best. But she was also my mother, and she was facing something terrifying and potentially life-threatening. "How is she handling the news?" I asked, my professional training in crisis management automatically engaging while my personal emotions remained carefully controlled. "She's scared," my father admitted. "Scared about the treatment, scared about the prognosis, and ... He paused, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "She's worried about the financial implications. Our insurance will cover most of the basic treatment, but there are experimental therapies that might be more effective, and the co-pays and deductibles are going to be substantial." I understood what he wasn't saying directly. My parents had been living comfortably, but not luxuriously, on my father's middle management salary and their modest savings. A serious illness with extensive treatment requirements could easily overwhelm their financial resources, especially if my mother was unable to work during treatment and recovery. "Would you consider coming home for a visit?" my father asked, his voice carrying a careful hopefulness. "I think it would mean a lot to her to see you, and there are some medical decisions where your perspective might be helpful." The request hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to address directly. This was the first time in years that my parents had asked for anything from me beyond polite conversation during our increasingly infrequent phone calls. It was also the first time my mother had expressed any desire to see me since my business success had made our family dynamics so complicated. I agreed to visit, not out of obligation or guilt, but because I was curious about how this crisis might change the relationships that had been frozen in patterns of distance and disappointment for so long. I also knew that whatever complicated feelings I had about my mother, I loved my father deeply and could see that he was struggling with more than he could manage alone. The flight back to my hometown gave me 5 hours to prepare emotionally for whatever I might encounter. I hadn't been back for more than brief holiday visits in recent years, And those had been carefully choreographed events designed to minimize tension and avoid difficult conversations. This visit would be different, more intimate, more honest, and potentially more painful. The hospital where my mother was being treated was a regional medical center that served several surrounding counties. As I navigated the parking garage and made my way through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, I was struck by how much smaller and more provincial everything seemed compared to the medical facilities I was accustomed to in San Francisco. My father met me in the waiting area outside the oncology ward, and I was shocked by how much he seemed to have aged in the months since I had last seen him. The stress of my mother's diagnosis and his worry about their financial future, it etched new lines around his eyes and added a stoop to his shoulders that spoke of burdens too heavy for one person to carry. "She's been asking for you," he said, as we walked toward her room. "Thinks she wants to talk, really talk, in a way she hasn't been able to before." My mother was sitting up in her hospital bed when we entered, and I was unprepared for how fragile she looked. The woman who had always seemed so concerned about appearances and social perceptions now appeared vulnerable and uncertain. Her carefully maintained composure, replaced by the raw fear that comes with facing your own mortality. "Isabelle," she said when she saw me, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard since I was very young, genuine. Emotion without the careful control that had characterized our interactions for so many years. We talked for an hour about her diagnosis, treatment options, and prognosis. The conversation was more honest and direct than any we had shared in decades. Perhaps because the cancer had stripped away some of the pretenses that had always complicated our relationship. She asked intelligent questions about my perspective on the medical decisions she was facing, treating me like a competent adult whose insights she valued, rather than a daughter whose achievements she felt compelled to minimize. But beneath the surface discussion about medical logistics, I could sense her growing awareness of how dramatically our positions had shifted. Here she was, vulnerable and dependent, asking for help from the daughter she had spent years trying to hide. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The person she had been embarrassed by was now the one with the resources and connections that might make the difference in her treatment options and long-term survival. As we talked, I found myself studying her face for signs of the mother I remembered from early childhood, before the accident and wheelchair had complicated everything between us. She was still there, underneath the fear and illness, but changed in ways that went beyond the physical effects of her diagnosis. "I know we haven't always had the easiest relationship," she said finally, her words careful and deliberate. "And I know there are things I should have handled differently over the years. But I hope you know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished, even if I haven't always been good at showing it." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer to acknowledgement than she had ever come before. I could see the effort it was costing her to admit even this much, to acknowledge that our relationship had been damaged by her choices rather than my limitations. The financial realities of her situation became clearer as my father and I met with her medical team to discuss treatment options. The standard protocol would be covered by insurance but offered limited chances of long-term survival. The experimental treatments that showed more promise were expensive and would require travel to specialized centers that were far from their support network. I realized, sitting in that sterile conference room, listening to doctors explain probabilities and costs, that I held my mother's future in my hands. The girl she had been ashamed of had become the woman who could determine whether she received the best possible care or had to settle for whatever their modest resources could afford. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 30 years had completely reversed, and we both understood it without anyone having to say it explicitly. She needed me now in ways that went far beyond emotional support, and I would have to decide how much of my success I was willing to share with someone who had never celebrated it. The conversation I had been avoiding for 30 years finally happened on a Thursday afternoon in my mother's hospital room. After the doctors had left and my father had gone to handle insurance paperwork, my mother and I were alone together. For the first time since my childhood, and the weight of everything unspoken between us filled the space like a presence neither of us could ignore any longer. I had been carrying around a letter in my briefcase for 3 days, pages I had written, but never sent during my college years. expressing all the hurt and disappointment that I had never been able to articulate directly. Something about seeing her so vulnerable had made me dig it out of the files I kept at home, as if her mortality had finally created space for the honesty that had been impossible when she seemed invulnerable. "Mom," I said, my voice steadier. Then I think we need to talk about some things that have been between us for a long time. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part apprehension, part resignation, and perhaps part relief that someone was finally going to name the elephant that had been living in our relationship for decades. I started with the wedding day, describing in detail how her whispered words had felt to a 9-year-old girl who had been so proud of her beautiful dress and her place in the family's celebration. I explained how that moment had taught me that love, even from family, could come with conditions that I could never meet, no matter how hard I tried. "I was embarrassed by your wheelchair, Isabelle. Everyone's staring at us." I repeated her exact words, watching her face as she heard them spoken back to her after all these years. "Do you remember saying that?" She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, I could see the recognition there. "I remember," she said quietly. "I remember being overwhelmed and scared and not knowing how to handle the attention." Recognition wasn't the same as understanding, and her response revealed that she still saw the problem as the attention my wheelchair drew rather than her reaction to that attention. I continued with the pattern of exclusions that had followed the birthday parties I wasn't allowed to attend, the family events where we always had other plans, the achievements that went uncelebrated because they drew too much notice too. Our family situation: every time you declined an invitation on my behalf, every time you found a reason I couldn't participate in something. "If you were teaching me that I was too much trouble to include," I explained. "If you were telling me that my presence was a burden rather than a gift." My mother's initial response was defensive, exactly as I had expected. She talked about wanting to protect me from other people's reactions, about the practical difficulties of accommodating my wheelchair, about the challenges she faced as a mother who hadn't been prepared for raising a child with a disability. "I was trying to do what was best for you," she insisted. "I didn't want you to be hurt by people's stares and questions." But I had grown beyond accepting protection as an excuse for exclusion. "Mom, I was already being hurt by your stares, by your discomfort, by your suggestion that I should be hidden rather than included. Other people's reactions were manageable. Yours weren't, because you were supposed to be on my side." I laid out the cumulative impact of her behavior with the same systematic approach I used in business presentations. The pattern of missed school events, the lukewarm responses to my academic achievements, the way she positioned herself away from my wheelchair in family photos, the careful distance she maintained during my most important moments. "When I won that writing contest in 5th grade, you acted like it was something to get through rather than something to celebrate," I said. "When I was elected student council president, you worried about the attention rather than feeling proud of my leadership. When I graduated from Stanford with honors, you didn't even come to the ceremony." Each example seemed to land with physical force, and I could see her beginning to understand not just the individual incidents, but the pattern. They create a systematic message that my achievements were somehow problematic rather than praiseworthy. The conversation reached its most difficult point when I confronted her about my broken engagement with David. "When I told you that he was embarrassed to be seen with me in public, you said maybe it was for the best. Do you understand how that felt? To have my own mother agree that being associated with my disability was too much to ask of someone who claimed to love me?" Her face crumpled at this, and for the first time in the conversation, I saw genuine recognition of the harm her words had caused. "I thought I was being realistic," she whispered. "I thought I was helping you avoid disappointment." "You were being complicit," I said, my voice remaining calm despite the emotion behind the words. "You were agreeing with him that I was too much trouble to love publicly, too embarrassing to claim as a partner. You were validating exactly the kind of thinking that had hurt me my entire childhood." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 30 years of unaddressed pain. My mother stared at her hands, and I could see her struggling with the reality of how her behavior had been experienced by the daughter she claimed to love and protect. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I didn't understand how it felt from your perspective. But ignorance wasn't the same as innocence, and I Wasn't prepared to accept lack of awareness as absolution for decades of emotional abandonment? Mom, I needed you to be proud of me. And I needed you to celebrate my successes without worrying about what other people would think. Okay? I needed you to believe that I was worth including rather than worth protecting from inclusion. The conversation continued for 2 hours, moving through specific incidents and general patterns. Through her attempts to justify her behavior and my insistence that impact mattered more than intention, I watched her struggle with the realization that the protection she thought she was providing had actually been a form of rejection that had shaped my entire understanding of my own worth. Her partial apology, when it finally came, felt insufficient and conditional. "I'm sorry if my behavior hurt you," she said. "I was doing the best I could with a situation I didn't understand." If I repeated, "Mom, there's no if about it. Your behavior did hurt me profoundly and repeatedly, and doing your best isn't the same as doing right by your daughter." By the end of the conversation, we had achieved something that felt like clarity rather than resolution. She understood, finally, how her choices had affected me. I understood that her behavior had been driven by her own fears and limitations rather than any assessment of my actual capabilities or worth. But understanding wasn't the same as healing, and awareness wasn't the same as apology. The conversation had named the damage between us without repairing it, had acknowledged the pattern without changing its effects on our relationship. As I prepared to leave the hospital that evening, my mother reached for my hand, the first voluntary physical contact she had initiated in years. "I wish I could do it over," she said, and there was genuine regret in her voice. "So do I replied. "But we can only decide what happens from here." The letter I had carried remained unread in my briefcase, its contents now spoken aloud in the hospital room where my mother lay, facing her own mortality. The confrontation I had avoided for decades was finally complete, but the relationship between us remained as complicated as ever, perhaps more honest now, but not necessarily closer to healing. News of my mother's cancer diagnosis spread through the extended family with the efficiency that only serious illness can inspire. And within days of my visit home, my phone began ringing with calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. The conversations followed a predictable pattern, expressions of concern for my mother's health, updates on treatment plans, and careful inquiries about how the family was handling everything. But underneath the surface concern, I could hear the real question everyone was asking, but no one wanted to voice directly. Would I be stepping in financially to support my mother's treatment? The family members who had excluded me from gatherings and positioned me at the edges of photographs were now looking to me as the person with the resources to make the difference between basic care and optimal treatment. The first direct request came from my Uncle Robert, my mother's brother. During a phone call that began with awkward small talk about my business success and gradually shifted toward the medical expenses that were mounting faster than my parents' insurance could cover them. "Your mother's always been proud of what you've accomplished," he said, the words carrying the weight of someone trying to rewrite history in service of current needs. "She talks about your company all the time, about how successful you've become." I let the lie sit in the silence between us, knowing that my mother had rarely mentioned my achievements and certainly hadn't celebrated them in family settings. Uncle Robert was attempting to create a narrative of family support that would make his eventual request for financial assistance seem reasonable rather than presumptuous. "The thing is, Isabelle," he continued, "the experimental treatments the doctors are recommending are really expensive. Your father's insurance covers the basics, but these new therapies could make all the difference in her prognosis. The family's been talking, and we're all going to chip in what we can. But honestly, most of us are just getting by ourselves." The assumption underlying his request was breathtaking in its entitlement. These were the same family members who had consistently treated my presence as optional, who had found ways to exclude me from important events, who had never bothered to acknowledge my achievements or include me in their definitions of family success. Now, they were expecting me to bankroll my mother's treatment while contributing token amounts themselves. I found myself thinking about the box of family photographs my mother had kept over the years, images that documented decades of gatherings, where I have been consistently positioned in the back row or excluded entirely. holiday celebrations where my wheelchair had been treated as a photographic inconvenience, milestone events where my absence had been more convenient than my inclusion talk. Cousin Sarah called the next day, her voice carrying the artificial warmth of someone who had suddenly remembered we were related. "Isabelle, I've been thinking so much about your mom's situation," she began, "and about how we've all grown apart over the years. The wedding day hung between us, unspoken the event, where I had learned that my mother was embarrassed by my wheelchair, where the family had collaborated in positioning me as an inconvenient presence rather than a beloved relative. Sarah seemed to understand that our current conversation was connected to that long ago afternoon in ways that neither of us wanted to address directly. "I know we haven't always done the best job of staying in touch," she continued, "but family is family, you know? And in times like this, we need to come together and support each other." Her words were carefully chosen to avoid any specific acknowledgement of how I had been treated over the years, while simultaneously appealing to family loyalty that had been notably absent when it might have benefited me. The irony was thick now that I had resources they needed. Suddenly, family bonds were important, and support was expected. My father, caught in the middle of these family dynamics, tried to serve as intermediary while managing his own complex feelings about asking for help from the daughter who had been systematically excluded from family celebrations for decades. During one of our private conversations, he attempted to address the contradiction directly. "I know your mother and some of the family haven't always handled things well," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of years of silent complicity. "I should have spoken up more, should have insisted that you be included and celebrated the way you deserved. I was wrong to let that pattern continue." His admission was both validating and heartbreaking. Here was acknowledgement that my exclusion had been recognized but not challenged, that my father had chosen family harmony over defending his daughter's rightful place in family gatherings and celebrations. "The thing is," he continued, "she's scared now, really scared. And I think she's starting to understand how badly she handled things with you over the years. This illness has a way of clarifying what really matters." But fear and regret weren't the same as genuine change, and a crisis-driven awakening wasn't equivalent to the years of consistent support I had needed and deserved. I found myself weighing my father's pain against the decades of emotional distance I had endured, trying to determine what I owed to family relationships that had been largely one-sided. The family meeting that took place the following weekend felt like a tribunal where I was expected to serve as both defendant and benefactor. Extended relatives gathered in my parents' living room, the same space where I had been subtly excluded from countless family discussions to coordinate their response to my mother's medical crisis. The conversation was carefully choreographed to avoid direct demands while making clear expectations. Various family members spoke about their own financial limitations, their willingness to contribute what they could, and their hope that everyone would do their part according to their capabilities. The unstated assumption was that my success created an obligation to carry the primary financial burden while others contributed token amounts. I listened to relatives who had treated me as an afterthought for years, now speaking about family loyalty and mutual support as if these principles had always guided our relationships. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. People who had excluded me from family photos were now invoking family bonds to justify their expectations of financial support. When they finally asked directly about my willingness to cover the experimental treatments, I gave them an answer that clearly established the boundaries I intended to maintain. "I'm willing to discuss contributing to Mom's medical expenses, but I need to understand exactly what kind of relationship we're talking about building going forward." The discomfort in the room was palpable as family members realized that my financial support might come with expectations about how I would be treated and included in family dynamics. They wanted my money without changing the patterns of exclusion that had characterized our relationships for decades. "I won't be contributing to a family that continues to treat me as an optional member," I explained. "If we're going to be family, then we need to actually function like family with genuine inclusion, mutual respect, and consistent presence in each other's lives." The silence that followed revealed the complexity of what I was proposing. These relatives had grown comfortable with maintaining distance while expecting support. with treating me as a resource to be accessed rather than a person to be included. My mother, watching this interaction from her position on the living room couch, seemed to understand for the first time that her illness had created an opportunity for the family reckoning that had been decades in the making. The daughter they had excluded was now in position to determine not just her medical treatment options, but the terms on which any future family relationships would be built. The meeting ended without resolution, with family members promising to think about everything while clearly struggling to accept that my financial support might require them to fundamentally change how they related to me. They wanted my resources without acknowledging the years of emotional exclusion that had created the distance between us. As relatives filed out of my parents' house, making awkward small talk and avoiding eye contact, I realized that my mother's illness had forced a conversation that went far beyond medical expenses. It had revealed the transactional nature of relationships I had once hoped might become genuinely supportive, and it had given me the power to decide whether those relationships were worth maintaining on any terms. The legal consultation I scheduled the week after the family meeting was with Patricia Williams, one of San Francisco's most respected estate planning attorneys. I had worked with Patricia on foundation matters and trusted her judgment on complex family dynamics that intersected with financial planning. What I needed now wasn't just legal advice about my mother's medical expenses, but guidance on how to structure any support in ways that protected my own interests while clarifying family obligations. If I want to understand exactly what I'm legally responsible for, I explained as we sat in Patricia's elegant downtown office, and what options I have for setting conditions on any financial assistance I might provide. Patricia listened carefully as I outlined the decades of family exclusion, the current medical crisis, and the sudden expectations that I would serve as primary financial support for someone who had spent years minimizing my presence in family events. Her questions were probing and practical, designed to help me think through both the immediate decisions and the long-term implications of whatever choice I made. The legal reality is simple, she said. You have no obligation to pay for your mother's medical treatment beyond what any adult child might choose to provide voluntarily. But the emotional and family dynamics are much more complex, and whatever you decide will affect your relationships for years to come. We discussed the various ways I could structure financial support if I chose to provide a direct payment to medical providers, establishment of a medical trust with specific conditions, or contribution to a family fund with clear parameters about how money would be used. Each option carried different implications for control, accountability, and ongoing family dynamics. If you do decide to contribute, Patricia advised, I'd recommend being very explicit about your expectations for how this changes family relationships going forward. People's gratitude during a crisis doesn't always translate into changed behavior. Once the crisis passes, I left that meeting with a clear understanding of my options and the legal frameworks that would protect my interests while allowing me to help if I chose to do so. But the business aspects of the decision were easier to navigate than the emotional complexities that kept me awake at night. Decades of hurt against the reality of my mother's mortality. The conversations with my father during this period were perhaps the most honest we had ever shared. He understood that I was struggling with conflicting emotions about how much support to provide and on what terms. More importantly, he seemed to recognize that his own role in enabling my mother's behavior over the years had contributed to the distance between us. I should have stood up for you more, he admitted during one of our late-night phone calls. I knew what was happening, and I told myself I was keeping peace in the family, but really I was just avoiding conflict at your expense. His acknowledgement meant more to me than any of the family's recent attempts to rewrite history or minimize the patterns of exclusion I had experienced. But even his honesty couldn't resolve the fundamental question of what I owed to family relationships. That had been largely one-sided for decades. The draft will I worked on with Patricia during this period forced me to confront my own values about family loyalty, personal responsibility, and the meaning of forgiveness. The document reflected years of careful thought about how I wanted my success to be distributed after my death, with the majority of my estate going to the foundation that supported young entrepreneurs with disabilities. The family members who had excluded me from photographs and events were notably absent from inheritance provisions, replaced by mentors, friends, and colleagues who had consistently supported and celebrated my achievements. The will represented my true chosen family, people who had earned their place in my life through consistent love and respect rather than claiming it through biological connection. But the section dealing with potential support for my parents during their lifetimes remained blank, awaiting the decision I was still struggling to make about my mother's medical expenses and our future relationship. My mother's health continued to decline while I wrestled with these decisions. The standard chemotherapy protocol was taking a serious toll on her strength and spirits, and the doctors were becoming more explicit about the advantages that experimental treatments might offer. Time was becoming a factor in ways that added urgency to choices I had hoped to make deliberately and without. Pressured. The phone call from my mother that finally broke the stalemate came on a Sunday evening while I was working in my home office. Her voice was weaker than I had ever heard it, and I could tell that the conversation was costing her significant effort. "Isabelle," she said, "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything after all these years. I know I failed you as a mother in ways that can't be undone. But I'm asking anyway, not because I deserve your help, but because I'm hoping you're a better person than I was." It was the closest she had ever come to a genuine apology, an acknowledgement that focused on her failures rather than my reactions, that took responsibility rather than making excuses. But even as I appreciated the honesty, I understood that desperation could inspire words that might not reflect lasting change in perspective or behavior. "What exactly are you asking for?" I replied, needing clarity about both the financial request and the relationship implications. "I'm asking if you'll help pay for the experimental treatment," she said. "But I'm also asking if you'll let me try to be the mother I should have been all along, even if it's too late to matter." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered territory we had never explored together: her fears about dying with our relationship unresolved, her regrets about the opportunities she had missed to celebrate my achievements, and her growing understanding of how her behavior had shaped my entire sense of self-worth. But I had learned to distinguish between crisis-driven realizations and genuine transformation, between words spoken under pressure and commitments that would endure beyond immediate need. My mother's desperation made her honesty possible, but it didn't guarantee that any changes in her behavior would survive her recovery. "I'm willing to pay for your basic medical treatment," I told her finally. "I'll cover the standard chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery that insurance doesn't fully pay for. But I won't fund experimental treatments or lifestyle maintenance beyond that." The silence that followed was heavy with disappointment, but I continued with the explanation I had been formulating throughout our conversation. "Mom, for 30 years you treated my presence as optional and my achievements as problematic. You missed my graduation, downplayed my successes, and suggested that my broken engagement was for the best. Love and support have to be earned through consistent behavior, not demanded through crisis." Her response surprised me with its acceptance rather than argument. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I'm grateful for whatever help you're willing to provide. It's more than I have any right to expect." The financial arrangement I established through Patricia was structured to cover essential medical expenses while avoiding the creation of dependency or expectation for ongoing support. I would pay for standard cancer treatment, but the family would need to find other resources for experimental therapies or additional care that went beyond basic needs. More importantly, I made clear that any financial support was contingent on changes in how I was treated and included in family dynamics going forward. There would be no more excluding me from photographs, no more missing my important events, and no more treating my achievements as sources of discomfort rather than pride. The family's reaction to my conditions revealed the limits of their willingness to change established patterns in exchange for financial support. Some relatives were willing to adjust their behavior in recognition of the resources I was providing, while others seemed to believe that family obligations should flow one direction, without requiring reciprocal respect or inclusion. But I had moved beyond needing family approval or fearing family rejection. The success I had built gave me the ultimate power in these relationships, the ability to choose who deserved access to my time, energy, and resources based on how they treated me rather than biological connection. The decision felt right, not because it was generous or forgiving, but because it aligned with my values about earned relationships and conditional support. I would help within limits I set, but I would not sacrifice my own standards for inclusion and respect in service of family harmony. That had never protected my own emotional needs. Standing in my office that evening, looking out at the city where I had built a life of unconditional acceptance and celebration, I understood that I had finally claimed the power to determine the terms of every relationship in my life. The girl who had learned to minimize herself to accommodate others' discomfort had become a woman who expected to be valued, rather than merely tolerated, supported rather than simply included. The business of forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about absolving others of their past behavior. It was about deciding what standards to maintain for future relationships, and who had earned the right to benefit from the success I had created entirely on my own terms. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday in October, 6 months after I had established the financial parameters for my mother's basic cancer treatment. My father's voice was tight with panic as he explained that my mother had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. The standard chemotherapy protocol wasn't working as effectively as hoped, and her oncologist was recommending immediate consideration of an experimental immunotherapy treatment that could potentially save her life. "The doctors say we have maybe 2 weeks to make a decision," he said, his words coming in rushed bursts between labored breaths. "The treatment is available at a research hospital in Houston, but it costs $180,000 and isn't covered by any insurance. Without it, they're saying she has maybe 3 to 6 months left." I sat in my darkened bedroom processing the information, while my father continued to explain the medical details and time constraints. This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for since establishing the boundaries around my financial support, the crisis point, where my decision about experimental treatment would literally determine whether my mother lived or died. "Have you talked to the rest of the family about fundraising?" I asked, knowing that the combined resources of all our relatives wouldn't approach the amount needed for the treatment. "We've tried," my father admitted. "Everyone's willing to contribute what they can, but we're talking about maybe $15,000 total from the whole family. Isabelle, you're the only one with the resources to make this possible." The weight of that statement settled over me like a physical presence. After 30 years of being treated as an optional family member, I was now the only person who could save my mother's life. The girl she had been embarrassed by at cousin Sarah's wedding was now the woman holding her survival in her hands. I flew back home the next day, not because I had made a decision about the experimental treatment, but because I needed to have one final conversation with my mother before determining what our relationship and her life was worth to me. The hospital room where I found her was smaller and more sterile than the one where she had received her initial treatment. My mother looked frailer than I had ever seen her, the aggressive cancer and intensive chemotherapy having stripped away the careful composure that had characterized her for as long as I could remember. She was awake when I arrived, though clearly struggling with pain and fatigue that medication could only partially address. "You came," she said when she saw me, and there was genuine surprise in her voice, as if she hadn't expected me to make the trip despite the severity of her condition. "I needed to talk to you," I replied, pulling a chair close to her bedside. "About the experimental treatment, about what you're asking from me, and about what kind of relationship we actually have." What followed was the most honest conversation we had ever shared, perhaps because we both understood it might be our last. I explained my perspective on the financial boundaries I had established, the reasons I was reluctant to fund experimental treatment, and the complex emotions I was experiencing about having her life literally in my hands. "For 30 years you treated me like a burden rather than a blessing," I said, my voice remaining calm despite the intensity of what I was expressing. "You missed my graduation, downplayed my achievements, and suggested that people had good reasons to be embarrassed by association with me. Now you need me to save your life, and I'm trying to figure out what I owe to someone who never celebrated my existence." My mother listened without interrupting, and I could see her processing not just my words but the accumulated weight of decades of choices that had led to this moment. When I finished speaking, she was quiet for several minutes, and I wondered if the conversation had exhausted her beyond her ability to respond. "You don't owe me anything," she said finally, her voice carrying a clarity that surprised me given her physical condition. "I failed you as a mother in ways that can't be fixed. Buy an expensive medical treatment. I was embarrassed when I should have been proud, distant when I should have been supportive, and concerned about other people's opinions when I should have been focused on your happiness and success." It was the first time she had taken full responsibility for our damaged relationship without qualifying her acknowledgement with explanations about her own fears or limitations. The apology felt genuine in ways that her previous attempts at reconciliation had not. "I understand if you can't justify spending that money on someone who never valued you properly," she continued. "And I understand if you've decided that some relationships can't be repaired no matter how much money or regret gets thrown at them." Her acceptance of responsibility and consequences created space for me to be honest about my own conflicted feelings. Part of me wanted to save her life regardless of our history, simply because she was my mother and because I had the resources to make the difference. But another part of me recognized that funding her experimental treatment wouldn't undo the decades of emotional damage or guarantee any meaningful change in our relationship if she survived. "The thing is, Mom," I said, "even if I pay for this treatment and it works, what kind of relationship would we have? Would you suddenly become proud of my achievements? Would you start celebrating my presence instead of managing it? Or would we go back to the same patterns once the crisis passed?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, and I appreciated that she didn't offer easy reassurances or promises that we both knew might not survive her recovery. "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to believe I would be different, that facing death has taught me what really matters. But I can't guarantee that fear of dying has made me a better person permanently rather than just temporarily." Her honesty was both heartbreaking and clarifying. Here was someone finally acknowledging the limitations of crisis-driven transformation and admitting that good intentions during desperate times might not translate into lasting change in behavior or perspective. The family meeting that took place later that day felt like a tribunal where I was expected to serve as both judge and financial savior. Extended relatives gathered in the hospital waiting room, many of the same people who had excluded me from family events for years, to make their case for why I should fund my mother's experimental treatment. The arguments they presented revealed the same sense of entitlement that had characterized their earlier requests for financial support. They spoke about family loyalty and moral obligation as if these principles had always guided our relationships, conveniently forgetting the decades of exclusion and minimization I had experienced. "She's your mother," Uncle Robert said, his tone suggesting that biological connection should override any consideration of how that relationship had actually functioned. Family takes care of family, especially when someone has the resources to make the difference between life and death. But I had moved beyond accepting obligation based solely on biological relationship, especially with people who had never treated me as family when I needed support and inclusion. The irony was thick now that I had resources they needed suddenly. Family bonds were sacred, and support was expected. Family takes care of family. I agreed, but that should work both directions. For 30 years, I needed a family that celebrated my achievements rather than managing them. That included me rather than excluding me. That treated my presence as a gift rather than a burden. That family support wasn't available when I needed it. The silence that followed revealed the discomfort of people who had never considered that their treatment of me might affect my willingness to help them during their own crisis. They wanted my resources without acknowledging the years of emotional neglect that had created the distance between us. My final decision came not from anger or revenge, but from a clear-eyed assessment of what kind of relationships were worth maintaining and what kinds of precedents I wanted to establish for how I could be treated by people who expected my support. "I will continue to pay for Mom's standard medical care," I announced to the assembled family. "Pain management, comfort care, and any treatments that are covered by insurance. But I won't fund experimental treatments that cost more than most people earn in several years. The shock and anger in the room were palpable, but I continued with the explanation I had been formulating throughout the day. Love and support have to be earned through consistent behavior over time. They can't be demanded during a crisis by people who never provided them when they were needed. I'm not going to bankrupt my conscience to save someone who never valued my existence until she needed my resources. My mother, watching this interaction from her wheelchair where my father had brought her for the family meeting, nodded slowly. There was sadness in her expression, but also what looked like acceptance and perhaps even understanding. "She's right," my mother said quietly, her voice carrying to every corner of the waiting room. "I never earned the kind of support I'm asking for. And asking someone to save your life when you never celebrated their existence isn't family loyalty, it's manipulation." The family meeting ended with relatives filing out in angry silence, their expectations of financial rescue dashed by my refusal to provide unlimited support regardless of how I had been treated. Some would never speak to me again, treating my decision as betrayal rather than justice. Others would eventually come to understand that relationships require mutual respect and consistent support rather than one-sided obligation during crises. My father's response was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire situation. He understood my decision intellectually and even agreed that my mother's treatment of me over the years made my financial boundaries reasonable. But emotionally, he was losing his wife and struggling to accept that his daughter's resources could save her but wouldn't be used for that purpose. "I don't blame you," he told me during our final private conversation, "but I can't pretend it doesn't break my heart that we have the solution sitting right here and can't access it." His pain was genuine and understandable, but it didn't change the fundamental dynamics that had led to this moment. The daughter they had excluded was now making choices about inclusion, and those choices reflected the same careful consideration of worth and treatment that had been applied to me for decades. I left the hospital that evening knowing that I had made a decision that aligned with my values about earned relationships and conditional support. The girl who had learned to minimize herself to accommodate others' discomfort had become a woman who maintained standards for how she expected to be treated, even when those standards carried life and death consequences for people who had failed. To meet them, the months following my decision about the experimental treatment brought changes I hadn't anticipated, both in my family dynamics and in my own understanding of what healing could look like when it wasn't dependent on dramatic gestures or expensive interventions. My mother's response to the standard treatment, while not the miraculous recovery that experimental therapy might have provided, was more positive than her doctors had initially predicted. She stabilized on a maintenance chemotherapy protocol that managed her cancer's progression while allowing her to maintain a reasonable quality of life. More importantly, her confrontation with mortality and with the reality of how our relationship had functioned for decades seemed to create space for the kind of honest reflection that had been impossible when she felt entitled to my support. Rather than grateful for whatever I chose to provide, the first indication that something fundamental had shifted came in a handwritten letter she sent 6 weeks after the family meeting at the hospital. Unlike the crisis-driven apologies she had offered when her survival seemed to depend on my financial support, this letter felt different, quieter, more thoughtful, and focused on understanding rather than persuasion. "I've been thinking about the kind of mother I was to you," she wrote in handwriting that showed the effects of chemotherapy but remained carefully legible. "Not the kind I intended to be or the kind I told myself I was, but the kind my actions actually demonstrated. I realize now that I spent 30 years teaching you that love was conditional on not causing embarrassment, that inclusion was dependent on not drawing attention, and that celebration was reserved for achievements that didn't remind people of your wheelchair." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing specific incidents she remembered, missed school events, lukewarm responses to my achievements, and moments when she had positioned herself away from my wheelchair in family photos. But, unlike her previous attempts at apology, this letter didn't include explanations or justifications. She simply acknowledged the pattern of behavior and took responsibility for its impact on my sense of self-worth. "I don't expect this acknowledgement to change your decision about the experimental treatment," she concluded, "and I don't expect it to repair the damage I did to our relationship. I'm writing this because you deserve to know that someone finally understands what they took from you. And because I want you to know that your decision to maintain boundaries was right and necessary. The letter moved me in ways I hadn't expected. Not because it changed the fundamental dynamics between us, but because it represented the kind of genuine accountability I had been hoping for my entire life. This wasn't an apology designed to secure financial support or family harmony. It was someone finally taking full responsibility for their choices and their impact. My response to her letter was equally honest about the complexity of my own feelings. I acknowledged her accountability while making clear that understanding the damage didn't automatically repair it, and that my financial boundaries would remain in place regardless of how our relationship evolved. But I also opened the door to building something new, a relationship based on the reality of who we both were now, rather than the mythology of unconditional family. Love that had never actually existed between us. If she was willing to consistently treat me with the respect and inclusion I had always deserved, then I was willing to explore what kind of connection might be possible. The process of rebuilding trust happened slowly and with careful attention to consistency rather than dramatic gestures. My mother began making efforts to be present for important events in my life, asking thoughtful questions about my work, and expressing genuine interest in the foundation's activities. When business magazines featured stories about my company's growth, she would call to congratulate me with enthusiasm that felt authentic rather than obligatory. More significantly, she began addressing her own role in family dynamics that had excluded me from gatherings and celebrations. She spoke directly to relatives about their treatment of me over the years, making clear that any future relationship with her would require them to treat me with appropriate respect and inclusion. My father's journey during this period was equally complex, but ultimately more successful in terms of genuine transformation. His guilt about enabling my mother's behavior for decades had been eating away at him, and he threw himself into making amends through both words and actions. He became my most reliable advocate within the extended family, challenging relatives who continued to express anger about my financial boundaries and educating them about the decades of exclusion that had led to the current situation. His defense of my decisions felt like the protection I had needed as a child but was only now receiving as an adult. "I should have stood up for you years ago," he told me during one of our weekly phone conversations. "I told myself I was keeping peace, but really I was just avoiding conflict at your expense. That was cowardly, and I'm sorry it took your mother's illness for me to find the courage to admit it." The therapy I began during this period helped me process the complicated emotions that arose from these tentative attempts at family healing. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in family trauma and disability issues, helped me understand that genuine healing required ongoing demonstration of changed behavior, rather than simply crisis-driven apologies. The fact that your mother is now acknowledging modus colloqui. For the fact that your mother is now acknowledging her past behavior is significant, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions. But healing happens through consistent experience of being valued rather than through verbal acknowledgement of past harm. Your right to maintain boundaries while observing whether words translate into lasting changes in how you're treated. The family events I began attending on my own terms provided opportunities to observe whether my relatives' promises of changed behavior would survive the return to normal family dynamics. Christmas dinner at my aunt's house became a test case. Would I be included in family photos naturally? Or would there be the same awkward positioning and careful framing that had characterized family gatherings for decades? The difference was immediately apparent. Without my mother's nervous management of my wheelchair's visibility, other family members seemed to relax into treating me like any other relative. I was positioned prominently in family photos, included naturally in conversations, and consulted about my preferences for activities and just logistics. My mother's contribution to this improved dynamic was subtle but important. Instead of managing how others reacted to my presence, she celebrated it. When relatives complimented my recent business achievements, she expressed genuine pride rather than discomfort. When conversation topics turned to accessibility or inclusion, she deferred to my expertise rather than changing the subject. The relationship we built over the following year was different from anything we had shared during my childhood or early adulthood. It was honest about our history, realistic about our limitations, and focused on what was possible going forward rather than what had been lost in the past. My mother's improved health, while not the dramatic recovery that experimental treatment might have provided, allowed her to experience this transformed relationship for nearly 2 years. She lived to see my foundation expand its programming, to attend the book launch for my second publication, and to witness my romantic relationship with Alex develop into something serious and committed. Her response to Alex was perhaps the clearest indication of how much she had genuinely changed in her understanding of disability and inclusion. Instead of expressing concern about logistics or other people's reactions, she welcomed him warmly and treated our relationship as a source of celebration rather than complexity. "He's wonderful," she told me after meeting Alex for the first time. "I can see how happy you are together, and it's clear he appreciates everything that makes you special." The conversation we had about my future with Alex revealed how much my mother's perspective had evolved. She asked thoughtful questions about our plans, expressed excitement about potential grandchildren, and spoke about my disability only in terms of ensuring that any wedding venues we chose would showcase rather than hide my wheelchair. When my mother's health began to decline again in her second year of treatment, the conversations we had about end-of-life planning were marked by the honesty and respect that had characterized our rebuilt relationship. She expressed gratitude for the time we had been able to have together, acknowledged the limitations of what we had been able to repair, and made clear that she understood my financial boundaries had been appropriate and necessary. "I'm grateful for the relationship we were able to build," she told me during one of our final conversations. "I know it couldn't undo the damage from earlier years, but it let me experience what it felt like to be proud of you without reservation. That was a gift I didn't deserve, but that I'm thankful you were willing to give." Her death came peacefully 2 years after our hospital confrontation, with my father and me present in the comfortable hospice room where she spent her final weeks. The grief I experienced was complicated sadness for the relationship we had lost during my childhood, gratitude for the healing we had been able to achieve, and a sense of completion that came from having spoken all the truths that needed to be shared between us. The memorial service we planned reflected the person she had become rather than the person she had been for most of my life. Friends and relatives spoke about her growth in understanding, inclusion, and accessibility, her pride in my achievements, and her advocacy for treating all family members with equal respect and celebration. Standing at the podium to deliver my own remarks, I chose to speak honestly about both the damage and the healing that had characterized our relationship. I acknowledged the years of exclusion and missed opportunities, but I also celebrated the courage it had taken for her to face her own behavior and work to change it. My mother spent the last years of her life learning to be proud rather than embarrassed, inclusive rather than exclusive, and celebratory rather than worried about other people's reactions. I said to the assembled mourners, "That transformation doesn't erase the earlier years, but it proves that people can change when they're willing to face uncomfortable truths about themselves." The healing I experienced wasn't the fairy tale reconciliation that some people might have hoped for, but it was real and meaningful within the constraints of what was actually possible. I had learned that forgiveness could coexist with boundaries, that love could exist without erasing accountability, and that some relationships could be rebuilt on new foundations, even when the original structure had been too damaged to repair. Most importantly, I had maintained my own integrity throughout the process, refusing to sacrifice my standards for inclusion and respect while remaining open to genuine change. When it was demonstrated consistently over time, the girl who had learned to minimize herself to accommodate others' discomfort had become a woman who expected to be celebrated, and who was capable of building meaningful relationships with people who met that expectation. 5 years have passed since my mother's death, and the bronze plaque mounted in the lobby of the Isabelle Arlene Foundation headquarters has become a daily reminder of the journey that brought me to this moment. The inscription reads simply, "Dedicated to empowering young people with disabilities to claim their space in the world with confidence and create positive change through their unique perspectives." It represents everything I learned about the difference between being accommodated and being celebrated, between being included and being valued. The foundation has grown beyond anything I imagined when I first established it during the early years of my business success. We now provide scholarships to over 200 students annually, operate mentorship programs in 12 cities, and have launched more than 50 successful businesses founded by entrepreneurs with disabilities. But the true measure of our impact isn't in the numbers, it's in the confident young leaders who understand that their perspectives are assets rather than limitations. Last month, I spoke at the graduation ceremony for our latest cohort of scholarship recipients, and I found myself thinking about the 9-year-old girl who had been embarrassed by her wheelchair at a family wedding. The young woman who introduced me, a brilliant engineer who had developed breakthrough adaptive technology while earning her master's degrees, spoke about claiming space in rooms where people like her had never been welcome, about refusing to minimize her presence to ease others' discomfort, and about building solutions that benefited everyone rather than just accommodating a few. Her words echoed the lessons I had learned through decades of navigating exclusion and creating inclusion. And I realized that the most important legacy of my own journey wasn't the business I had built or the wealth I had accumulated, was the permission I could give others to expect celebration rather than mere tolerance, to demand respect rather than settle for accommodation. The book I published 2 years ago, Universal Advantage: Building Success Through Inclusive Design, became a bestseller that opened new conversations about accessibility in business and society. But the project I'm most proud of is the memoir I completed last year, Honest Account of Family Dynamics, Personal Empowerment, and the Complex Process of Building Relationships Based on Mutual Respect Rather than Obligation. The memoir's success has brought speaking invitations from universities, corporations, and advocacy organizations around the world. But the responses that matter most come from readers who recognize their own experiences in my story, people who have learned to minimize themselves to accommodate others' discomfort, who have been excluded from celebrations while being expected, to provide support during crises, who are discovering that they have the power to demand better treatment and build chosen families that truly value their presence. My romantic relationship with Alex has evolved into the kind of partnership I always hoped was possible but wasn't sure I would find. He's a successful architect who specializes in universal design, and our collaboration on both personal and professional projects demonstrates daily that love doesn't require accommodation. It simply requires two people who celebrate each other's strengths and navigate challenges as a team. When we married 3 years ago, the wedding was everything I had dreamed of since childhood: elegant, inclusive, and focused entirely on celebrating our love rather than managing anyone's discomfort with my wheelchair. The photographs from that day show me positioned prominently and proudly, surrounded by friends and chosen family who had earned their place in our celebration through years of consistent support and genuine affection. My father walked me down the aisle with obvious pride, and his toast at the reception spoke about watching me transform from a girl who had learned to minimize herself into a woman who claimed space confidently and used that space to benefit others. The absence of family members who had excluded me over the years was notable, but not painful. I was surrounded by people who had consistently demonstrated their love and respect. The luxury home Alex and I share in Pacific Heights has become a showcase for how universal design principles can create spaces that are both beautiful and functional for everyone. We regularly host events for the foundation, client meetings for both our businesses, and social gatherings that bring together the diverse community of friends and colleagues who have become our chosen family. The adapted vehicles in our garages leak. High-performance cars with seamless modifications make the same statement I've been making throughout my professional life. Accessibility and excellence are perfectly compatible, and accommodation doesn't require sacrifice of style or functionality. The investment portfolio I've built over the past decade reflects not just financial success, but also values-driven choices about which companies and organizations deserve my support. I invest in businesses that prioritize inclusive design, in startups founded by entrepreneurs with disabilities, and in organizations that demonstrate through actions rather than words their commitment to creating opportunities for everyone. The will I finalized last year leaves the majority of my estate to the foundation, ensuring that the work of empowering young people with disabilities will continue long after I'm gone. The document reflects my understanding that the most valuable inheritance I can leave isn't money, it's the institutions and programs that will help others avoid the isolation and exclusion I experienced while building lives of genuine celebration and inclusion. My father, now in his 70s, has become one of the Foundation's most dedicated volunteers and advocates. His guilt about the years when he failed to stand up for me has transformed into passionate commitment to ensuring that other young people receive the support and celebration they deserve from the beginning. His weekly calls still bring updates about family dynamics, but now they also include stories about Foundation scholarship recipients. He's mentoring and advocacy work he's doing in his retirement community. The extended family members who expressed anger about my financial boundaries during my mother's illness have largely faded from my life, exactly as I expected they would. Some eventually came to understand that relationships require mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation, while others continued to view my standards as unreasonable rather than necessary. The distinction helped me identify which relationships were worth maintaining and which were better left in the past. Cousin Sarah reached out with apologies about the wedding day where my mother's shame was first expressed so explicitly. It's become an unexpected ally in family dynamics. She now advocates actively for inclusion and accessibility in her own community, and she credits our conversations about childhood exclusion with helping her understand how disability is often treated as a family burden rather than a source of diversity and strength. The speaking engagements that fill my calendar take me to conferences and universities where I share insights about entrepreneurship, inclusion, and the business advantages of universal design. But the presentations I find most meaningful are those where I speak to young people with disabilities about claiming their space in the world with confidence and refusing to minimize their presence to ease others' discomfort. Standing on stages where I once couldn't have imagined being invited, addressing audiences who are genuinely interested in my insights and expertise, I'm reminded daily that the journey from exclusion to celebration was worth every difficult choice and maintained boundary. The girl who learned to make herself smaller to accommodate others' embarrassment became a woman who expects to be valued and celebrated, and who has built institutions that help others make the same transformation. The letter I keep framed in my office is the final one my mother sent before her death, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to experience what it felt like to be genuinely proud of her daughter without reservation or concern about other people's reactions. Her words serve as a reminder that even damaged relationships can sometimes be rebuilt on foundations of honesty and mutual respect, and that healing doesn't require forgetting the past, but rather learning from it. The empty engagement ring box from my relationship with David remains in my desk drawer, not as a symbol of heartbreak, but as a reminder that love which comes with conditions to minimize yourself isn't love worth accepting. Alex's wedding ring on my finger represents the opposite love that celebrates rather than accommodates, that showcases rather than hides, that treats my presence as a gift rather than a challenge to be managed. The bronze plaque in our foundation lobby captures the essence of everything I've learned about the difference between inspiration and empowerment, between accommodation and celebration, between being tolerated and being valued. The young people who walk through our doors learn that their perspectives are assets to be developed rather than limitations to be overcome, that their presence enhances every space they enter rather than requiring special arrangements. Reflecting on the 30-year journey from that devastating moment at Cousin Sarah's wedding to this moment of complete professional and personal fulfillment, I understand that the most important transformation wasn't in my circumstances, it was in my understanding of my own worth. The external success and recognition matter, but they matter because they reflect an internal certainty that I belong wherever I choose to go, and that my presence makes those spaces better for everyone. The girl who was embarrassed by her wheelchair became a woman who understands that other people's discomfort belongs to them, not to her. The daughter who was excluded from family celebrations became someone who builds communities where everyone is genuinely valued. The child who learned to minimize herself became an adult who claims space confidently and uses that space to create positive change. Standing in my office this morning, looking out at the San Francisco Bay where fog is lifting to reveal another day of infinite possibilities, I know with absolute certainty that I have built exactly the life I was meant to live. Not despite my wheelchair, not in spite of the exclusion I experienced, but because those experiences taught me the difference between conditional and unconditional love, between accommodation and celebration, between being included and being truly valued. That the legacy I'm building isn't about overcoming disability. It's about refusing to accept less than the full celebration and inclusion that every person deserves. It's about understanding that love and respect must be earned through consistent behavior. That family is defined by actions rather than biology. And that the most important choice any of us can make is to surround ourselves with people who celebrate our presence rather than merely tolerating it. The story that began with a mother's whispered shame at a family wedding has become a testament to the power of claiming your own worth, setting your own standards, and building relationships with people who understand that your presence is a gift to be celebrated rather than a burden to be managed. It's a story about transformation, justice, and the quiet revolution that happens when someone decides they deserve better treatment and has the courage to demand it. Most importantly, it's a story about choosing your own family, creating your own legacy, and understanding that the greatest revenge against those who undervalued you is simply living a life of complete fulfillment and joy, a life where your worth is never questioned because you've surrounded yourself with people who understand it instinctively and celebrate it consistently. The bronze plaque will outlast my lifetime, but the real legacy lives in every young person who learns to claim their space confidently, every family that chooses celebration over accommodation, and every person who understands that true love doesn't require you to minimize yourself. It requires finding people who want to maximize your potential and celebrate your presence in their lives.